Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. Also, good evening also to those who watch at Facebook and YouTube. I'm very happy that you are here. Some of you, in spite of COVID, personally. Thank you for foreign former ministers, ambassadors, dear friends. You're all welcome. Today already we had some panel discussions, and I want briefly, as far as it is possible, briefly to summarize what has been just discussed. Of course, only some points, and it's also a personal choice. The debate was about European security. Well, there were perhaps two lines of thinking and discussing. The one thought, why should we not think about what happened in the past and when there was still the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc and the Communist Bloc representing the East, and nevertheless we had dialogue, we had common decisions. So we could learn from analogies of the past. And there were others who argued that we have to think about the new conditions we have. The United States tending more towards Asia, what is called the pivot to Asia. The EU is in a different way, very diverse, with some countries trying to have good relationship with Russia, others not so good relations with Russia, or maybe even negative attitudes, principal negative attitudes towards Russia. And Russia itself, of course, trying to regain territory it lost in the past when we think about Eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. So I think maybe it's a combination of thinking in another way as we did in the past, because the situation in our countries, in our region changed, sometimes even dramatically. And on the other hand, of course, learning from the past that still to have a dialogue, still to have a discussion, even if you have antagonistic and opposite ideas, would be necessary. The second point was that specifically we discussed what sometimes is called the countries in between. I don't like this very much, because in between, you don't want to be in between, you want to be yourself. But nevertheless, this expression has been discussed, especially on the case of Ukraine and Moldova, where also the question of neutrality as a way out has been discussed. But of course, there was an argument, will that prevent that Russian troops will stay in the countries like in Ukraine or in Transnistria? Is neutrality really a model of possibility to come out of this stalemate? I think personally one should first know what neutrality would mean in these cases, what offer that would mean for Russia's reaction before going into that endeavor. Thirdly was, of course, we discussed a lot about Russia and its interest. You know, elections have been done in Russia. There are two figures, the real figures and the official figures. Nevertheless, of course, there seems to be general support for Russia's policy, but diminishing support. It seems that some of the different parties who have a different attitude towards Russian policy, for example, also the communists are still alive, and even perhaps somewhat stronger, have been strengthened. Nevertheless, that will not change very much the position of President Putin. And it has been discussed, what are the interests of Russia? Is really Russia ready for a dialogue? Or is not a stronger voice in Russia can be seen today, which is in some way trying, even perhaps interested in war, or at least in conflict? So that, of course, would also influence our attitude and our way how to promote a dialogue if we have Russia, on the other hand, on the other side, which is maybe even interested in a dialogue. The last but one point is, of course, the question we discussed very much about the OSCE. All of us, more or less, have been disappointed about the relatively weak position of the OSCE, the turmoil there, the conflicts internally in the OSCE. When we think back, OSCE was the big answer of the conflict or the division in Europe, that you can have very diverse attitudes, the communist bloc, the Western capitalist bloc, and nevertheless you can try to find solutions. Nowadays we don't have these kind of blocs, but nevertheless we have an OSCE which is not strong enough to solve some of the issues. It helps sometimes, as it did in the Ukraine crisis, at least to dampen down the conflict and to prevent an outright war, but it gave not the answer to the European security demands as it was hoped for. Some even suggested maybe other issues like climate change have to be brought into the OSCE to have, again, a fruitful and constructive discussion. Finally, and I'm coming also to one of the main points for the discussion tonight, is the question of Afghanistan. Not so much that the internal situation in Afghanistan is something which we, elaborated, but the question, of course, was asked after Afghanistan, what does it mean for European security? Is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think personally was inevitable on the one hand, but was on the other hand maybe done in a chaotic way, does it mean that Europe cannot count on the United States of America for its security? Is America only interested in finding the conflict with China and be strong with China? When we saw recently also the agreement between the US, Australia, and United Kingdom on an alliance, to form an alliance which obviously is an alliance against China, or at least is some red card to China and China's maybe expansionary interest, then of course one can doubt that the US has this kind of interest in looking at Europe as a main element where they want to keep security. Of course, in addition, maybe that will be mentioned, it was also some setback for France as one leading member of the European Union, nuclear member, on the one hand, member of the Security Council, because there were already discussions between France and Australia on some sort of an alliance. You can have a different discussion. You can say it is good that France was not included because it would have split the European Union again, that one country is going out and going into this alliance. On the other hand, you can say this was some, let's say, backlash for the European Union, as the European Union as a whole was left out. Nevertheless, I think now the call, which has been done also in the past already by Madame Merkel, also during the Trump era, that we have to care more for our own security. In some way, we have to take into account and to respect, without, again, my personal opinion, that we go for an overall militarization of the European Union, that we step up all our expenditures on defense. If we look to Europe as it is split, as it is not able to coordinate its defense activities, including the armament, then maybe this would be a way to react, that more coordination, more cooperation also in the defense field inside the European Union is necessary, and not just jump into more expenditure for defense. So these have been some points we have been discussing, which may be leading also to the discussion for tonight. Again, disappointment that the OSCE is not helping us very much, at least at the moment. Secondly, that nevertheless we need some dialogue to at least not sever the links between the different parts of Europe, and Russia is a part of Europe if it's not a part of the European Union. And finally, of course, how do we think that after Afghanistan we can open again the alliance with the US without Europe being just a dependent ally of the US, without that Europe cannot act alone if it is necessary. So in that sense, I try to give some bridge to our moderator. Thank you again for coming. Thank you for all those who watch us at Facebook and YouTube. And of course, you can see it also on our websites in the next weeks and months. And with this, I hand over to you for moderating this discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hannes. Thank you very much for your welcome words, for wrapping up the discussion that we had in the workshops today, and for the introduction to the theme that we are discussing tonight, European security, fallout from Afghanistan, lessons for the EU, NATO, and the OSCE. My name is Gerhard Mache. I am responsible for European affairs at the Karl-Renner-Institut. Actually, Director Maria MALTSCHNIG should have moderated the discussion, but unfortunately she couldn't come. There is a COVID case in her daughter's school, so this entailed a series of protection measures. So this is the reason why I'm here. A warm welcome to you here in Orania and those who follow us on Zoom, Facebook, and Twitter. A very warm welcome also to our 4 speakers. Let me briefly present them to you. 2 of them are connected to us via video conference. 2 are here in Orania. Let me start by alphabetical order. From Washington, we have with us Daniel Hamilton. He's Director of Global Europe Program at the Wilson Center. in Washington, D.C., and he's also Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Distinguished Fellow. A warm welcome, Daniel. Then we have Bruno MAÇÄES. He is a senior advisor at Flint Global in London. He is also senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And he is former Europe Minister of Portugal. A few years ago, he served as minister in Portugal. And what is also important for our discussion tonight, mid-August, he was in Kabul 2 days till the fall of Kabul. So this is also a very interesting detail for the discussion that we will have. Also via Zoom is Clarisse PASZTORY. She's deputy head of the OSCE presence in Albania, and she was head of the Liaison office of the European Union in Erbil, Iraq. So she has expertise on OSCE and EU and the Middle East. And we also have LEJLA VISNJIC, Secretary General of the Socialist Youth Austria, to bring in the perspective, so to say, of the Austrian Social Democrats, but also from the youth. A warm welcome to all of you. Since Hannes has already introduced the theme to you, I would like to start immediately with the questions. But before I invite you to, also those who follow us on Facebook and YouTube, I would like to ask those to comment, to ask questions, also on these channels. We will try to bring them into the discussion, as well as the questions from the audience here in person at Urania. And these questions will be forwarded to me on via WhatsApp, so it's not rude if I watch from time to time on my mobile phone. So let's jump into the discussion. As Hannes said, we'll try to analyze the situation in Afghanistan. What did go wrong? What should the EU, what should the international community do now with the disaster that we have? And what are the lessons to learn from Afghanistan, from these events, for the three organizations that I mentioned, OSCE, EU especially, and NATO. My first question goes to Daniel Hamilton in Washington. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was decided in the White House. The European allies had to follow suit, to put it bluntly. There have been some disagreements and dissatisfaction in Europe with Washington's decisions. European partners tend to perceive a lack of reliability when it comes to the US. What should the USA and the international community have done better in the last few weeks, months, or even years in Afghanistan? And let me add a second question regarding the geopolitical implications of the situation right now. Russia and China, the big rival of the USA on a global level, are regarded to some extent as the winners of the situation in Afghanistan and even beyond. The Western community, so to say, is regarded, perceived as the loser. How would you assess this, the situation in Afghanistan and beyond, also from the geopolitical perspective? Daniel Hamilton, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Guten Abend. Ich bedanke mich sehr bei den Veranstaltern. you had two questions. Let me speak first on Afghanistan itself. You know, I think if we're honest, we would acknowledge that almost since the beginning of our engagement there, we had two different strategies coexisting uneasily next to each other. One was a counter-terror exercise trying to exterminate Al-Qaeda. The other, though, became one of nation building. And I think if we're honest, you know, for several years, we didn't know which strategy we were pursuing. We mixed them up. We were very clear about what we were actually fighting for. Was it an anti-terror operation, or did it have to do with, you know, nation building, spread of democracy, human rights in that country? And it was unclear which we were really pursuing. Neither one of them were we actually enforcing or implementing well. And now we're sitting here without a strategy at all. I think we should acknowledge we didn't have the resources, we didn't have the knowledge of the territory, and nor could we really, you know, use our militaries to remake a country in a way that it would be looking like Luxembourg or something like that. It's just, you know, it's just far beyond our capability. That said, I think in the recent events, of course, you know, Donald Trump started to negotiate with the Taliban. He set himself a deadline of May this year where he was going to be ready to leave. Those negotiations undermined the credibility of the Afghan government completely. And President Biden was left with that sort of situation. Now, President Biden's been very clear personally, he was always committed to withdrawing. But let's not, you know, let's not sort of just make this a one-sided show. Europeans were also anxious to get out because they realized they didn't have a strategy either. We should acknowledge we all tolerated massive corruption on the part of the Afghan government. And of course, the implementation, as you mentioned, of the withdrawal was just awful. It was a tragedy and a disaster. So there's enough blame to go around. Your second question had to do with the other external actors. So I don't think it's such a, you know, such a black and white issue for Russia, China winning, the West losing. Russia now is confronted with what the US and NATO engagement have prevented, which is the emergence of sort of a black hole on its southern border. Now it's there, and they have to confront it. They're concerned about jihadi terrorism themselves, groups like Islamic Jihad spilling over either into Russia itself or Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. They're concerned about uncontrolled weapons flows to the Taliban, the threat of extremism coming from Afghan refugees flowing across into Central Asia. They have concerns, big concerns about the drug trade. You know, the most opium and heroin consumed in Russia comes from Afghanistan. So there's additional issues the Russians have. They've been trying to recently engage the regional actors to try to stem some of this, but Russia's not, you know, a winner from this disaster. China too, I think, despite all their bluster, Chinese leaders are very anxious about what's happening in Afghanistan because it also could enable jihadi terror to spill over into its own Western region, which is home to large Muslim populations, especially in Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are, as we know, in concentration camps, and it's a concern for the Chinese. So the Chinese are also left with a collapse of the Afghan economy. They had tried to pour money into it in the past and always didn't work, including mineral deposits. There's sort of speculation in the media right now about China coming in to sweep up mineral, but you know, they tried this before. It always was a failure. So, you know, both China and Russia are worried about extremist transnational flows that could affect their own territories, and it'll test their own relationships also with countries like Pakistan and others. So I'm not so sure that it's a win for anybody, really. Even the Taliban are finding it's very hard to govern in a country that's had to go through what Afghanistan has had to go through. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, as you see it, there's actually no winner, no geopolitical winner from the situation in Afghanistan. Let me turn to Clarisse. I think you're connected to us from Tirana, is this right? I would like to invite you to comment on that, what Daniel said, but the question to you is also, what are the implications of the situation in Afghanistan and the events for Asia, Central Asia, for the Middle East? You were in, as I said at the beginning, you were in Iraq, and overall in the influence of the West in this region, Middle East, Central Asia, what are the implications? And on a more general note, maybe Afghanistan is a failure of an international intervention. What are the lessons to learn from here when it comes to interventions, or are there possible positive examples of interventions? Clarisse, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I've been in Iraq and many places in Saudi, Yemen, Kurdistan, Syria, whatever. Luckily, not in Afghanistan, which probably serves as a slight advantage right now, speaking about this situation, probably with slightly less emotion. I'll pick up where Daniel sort of started out, and I entirely agree. I have worked in 7 or 8, 9 actually active conflicts. And one of the absolute lessons learned that is, I think, undisputable is that you need to have a mandate and an objective. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, it will be difficult to achieve. We went into Afghanistan in order to beat the Taliban as a counterterrorism mission. Then it was Osama bin Laden, and then it turned democracy. Similar to Iraq, we went in for the weapons of mass destruction, state for democracy. And while imposing democracy is kind of a contradiction in terms in itself already, it certainly cannot continue with the same means. The military is very good in pursuing military objectives, but not necessarily in creating democracy. Secondly, the mistake made by many, including sort of modern diplomacy and development workers, is sort of mistaking elections for democracy. Elections ought to be the last bit in establishing democracy. First, you need laws, regardless of who authorized them. Then you need institutions to actually implement those laws and create the so-called rule of law, where you have equal implementation of the law. And then you can think about elections. And we tend to do it the other way around. Equally, I said sort of, you need the law and you need institutions to implement the law. I think both the European Union and the OSCE used to be much better, and also the Americans, and more longevity in sort of creating institutions, which isn't sexy and which is hard work and which doesn't give you immediate benefits. I nowadays see all organizations, including international organizations, to put much more focus on civil society and non-governmental groups, which are fantastic and needed, but to complement institutions and not to replace institutions. And we really have issues with much more focus on creating a functioning civil society, which is important in a democracy, but not creating functioning institutions. And these are a couple of issues that can be mentioned in things that generally, this is not just Afghanistan specific, but in many of the areas where it didn't work, is a change of objective. You can argue whether sort of the intervention was right or wrong. I would actually argue also together with that it was legitimate. You can argue whether the departure was right or not. I also would argue it was at some point it had to come, but the way how it is done and what happens in between, and then the fainting of surprise. I don't know a single Afghanistan analyst who didn't say that when the Americans are leaving, the Taliban are going to take over. The question was one about timing, 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months. The fact that everybody now pretends they didn't see this coming is simply dishonest, and that brings me to the second question, and also to something that was mentioned before. Hannes spoke about the blocks that are, despite the fact that the blocks it worked, and he also talked about the weakness of the OSCE. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with either. I was just reformulated. It's not despite the fact that we had blocks it worked. I would say it is because we had the blocks we worked. The OSCE came into being 25 years after the end of World War II and the emergence of blocks. Economic integration, political integration, military integration, and eventually a creation of a balance of power and a balance of threat. That didn't only enable the blocs to speak to each other, but forced them to speak to each other and to come to agreements. Now we don't have that anymore. We don't have the Eastern Bloc, for better or worse. I would even argue we don't have the Western Bloc. I'm always asking myself, for example, whether Austria is part of the West and how we define the West nowadays. If it's NATO and geography, then Albania is certainly more Western than Austria, for example. But it has been replaced by what I call TTTT, temporary, so very short term, tactical, transactional, meaning sort of immediate give and takes, and very topical. So depending on the subject, we are friends with one and enemies with the other and make sort of short-term agreements. And this does not serve, of course, broader-based agreements or organizations, if it's even an organization, or treaty organizations like the OSCE. A platform, the OSCE is a platform, and a platform can only be as good as the actors that are playing on it. If you have the Scala or the Vienna State Opera, which are fantastic houses, but you have lousy or no actors singing and playing on it, then there won't be a good performance. And currently the OSCE is, and that's not the fault of the organization or the people working for it, is an exchange of, it's not a dialogue. It's a monologue between sort of themselves. Everybody just repeats their position, and that cannot bring an agreement. Now, I don't want to get too long, but to answer also to your last question a little bit, you asked whether sort of the OSCE could get engaged in Afghanistan fallouts and etc. I think there's this old joke about diplomats. If you ask a diplomat, if this and this is a good idea, what do you think about this? You say, good idea. Do you have anything to add? You say, not a good idea. And I think that is the case also when it comes to OSCE engagement in Afghanistan. In principle, yes, I even looked it up immediately after both invasions in Afghanistan and then Iraq. There were considerations of engaging the OSCE in security sector reform, etc. It never played out. Practically, given the fact that, as we say, the organization currently is internally weak and hardly more needed than ever, I would argue, but hardly better suited to solve problems on and within Europe. I'm not sure they have the capacity. Yet, I also have to say we are trying, and there is a number of things going on. For example, last week there was a meeting of the OSCE Asia conference, because we have a couple of Asian non-members but partners, where exactly it was discussed sort of what can we do. I think it's usually wrong to say let's go in and then decide, to come back to the beginning, what we do. First, we need to define what could we do and what are our capacities. And this is being discussed, not least in terms of organized crime. Afghanistan is a drug route, trade and etc., where the OSCE might be able to do something. But also, and that's my last point, you might have heard that here in Albania we are currently hosting, or Albania is currently hosting some 700-800 Afghans, it might get more. And interestingly enough, most of them are former journalists, members of the Human Rights Commission, etc. So we're currently thinking, or the Albanian government together with those refugees are currently thinking about how could they use the space and the freedom that they have here to pursue their objectives in Afghanistan, for themselves to continue to have a voice. I don't believe in simply resetting in people and depopulating Afghanistan from all of the good people and then think we did a good thing. We have to use those Afghans that we currently have to actually try to make a change in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarisse. I'd like to bring in Bruno MAÇÄES now into the discussion. As I said, he was in mid-August in Kabul. Where do you see the reason for the failure of the international community, especially NATO and the US in Afghanistan, their engagement? And when it comes to the situation now, what should be done now when it comes to humanitarian assistance, cooperation, recognition of the Taliban, terrorism, migration, maybe even in the direction of Europe? How would you assess the situation?
I think I'm going to sound more critical. I think I'm going to sound. It was okay. I think I'm going to sound a bit more critical than Daniel Hamilton about what took place. My experience in Kabul was of a complete, unexpected collapse. Everyone expected the Taliban to eventually arrive in Kabul, but certainly not before the American evacuation. Our plan was to have an ordered evacuation of a period of weeks. The plan was for the regime to hold, perhaps for 6 months. And then suddenly, not only did the city fall before the evacuation started, it fell before the evacuation even started to be planned. That was how sudden it was. The whole thing fell apart in hours. It felt like hours. From Secretary Blinken is on record saying that when eventually the regime falls, it will not be from a Friday to a Monday. You can check the YouTube. And he was right. It wasn't from a Friday to a Monday. It was from a Friday to a Sunday. It took 2 days for Herat and Kandahar fell on a Friday. Kabul fell on Sunday. And I think we have to ask very hard questions of how this could happen. There's a level of self-deception in Washington right now. It goes something like this, that the US won the war in Afghanistan, but lost the battle for nation building. And nation building is presented as an extraordinarily ambitious project of transforming Afghanistan into a liberal democracy. Well, that's, in my view, not what happened at all. The US lost the war. The US militarily lost the war against the Taliban. In fact, if you check the Wikipedia page for Afghanistan war, you're going to see started 2001, ended 2021, and then in brackets, Taliban won. And no one has corrected this yet. So the US lost the war, and as for nation building, I didn't see nation building over the past 20 years. It was very clear to me that what was happening was the US was trying to create conditions for an exit. There was an exit strategy, so you have to build up the military, you have to build up the Afghan state in order to create a stable enough situation that you can leave. And more interestingly, in order to create the appearance that the US is no longer at war. The war is taking place between the Afghan government and an insurgency. The US are just bystanders, we can leave, and the situation will be stable enough. But what happened, of course, is that, by the way, the US only started to speak about the absence of a war in the conventional sense in Afghanistan in 2014. For 13 years, until 2014, the US was in a traditional war against the Taliban. Only when it became evident that it could not win the war did it start to talk about this is not really a war in the conventional sense, we're only engaged in counterterrorism, Al-Qaeda is our priority. But for 2001 till 2014, the mission was to defeat the Taliban. So that to go back to my point that in fact the US lost the war against the Taliban. And then there was an effort to create the appearance that there was no war, to build up an army and a state. There's a recent book by a Washington Post journalist called Afghanistan Papers that I highly recommend, where he describes the almost comical efforts to create an Afghan state, an Afghan army. And then what happened in August, a month ago, was that, and in July when the US left Bagram Air Base, without US support, the whole effort of 20 years completely fell apart. And there's nothing left. I mean, the plan was to have some kind of arrangement, some kind of agreement, some kind of sharing of power between the old regime and the Taliban. But the old regime is like a Potemkin village. The whole thing disappeared, paper dust. And there has to be serious questions asked about how the effort of 20 years disappears in days, from a Friday to a Sunday. This, by the way, the European diplomats that I talked about in Kabul, this is what really saddened them. So much effort, so much money, so much lives lost on the one hand, but also devoted to this. People that started to work in NGOs 20 years ago, and there's nothing left. So my diagnosis is a lot more negative than I think the average you see on the media. And what happens now? Well, I think we do have to conclude that there are many serious doubts about the US role, particularly outside its focus of attention. So I don't conclude anything from this, from what I just said about Taiwan, because the US will be laser focused on Taiwan and on the Indo-Pacific and on the South China Sea, and perhaps having a more serious strategy in those scenarios than it had in Afghanistan. But what happens to all those geographies, some of them close to Europe, where we expect the US to have a stabilizing influence or to intervene if necessary? All our eastern neighborhood, Middle East, Northern Africa, our borders with Russia. I think there are serious doubts about the US's role here. So great and so deep is the failure in Afghanistan. And so I am with those who think that if this is not a wake-up call, to use a very common expression for the European Union, for European countries within NATO, for OSCE, if possible and doable. I mean, nothing else could be, because there are now serious doubts about whether we can rely on the US in our immediate and not so immediate neighborhoods in the Middle East, in North Africa, in the Sahel, also our borders with Russia, and so on and so forth. I think the conclusion has to be that things didn't work out, and clearly what the US is concluding is that it will not allow itself to be attracted to any kind of mission outside its immediate area of concern, which is now far away from Europe, on the other side of the world, in the on the maritime borders of China.
Okay, thank you for your assessment of this complete failure in Afghanistan. Now let me turn to Laila VISNJIC. I assume that the socialist youth has always been critical of the intervention, of the military intervention and the war in Afghanistan. Now, after the withdrawal and seeing this disaster, this complete failure, and the worsening situation for the population, especially women, what is your assessment now? Should NATO have stayed with troops in Afghanistan? Was this withdrawal a failure? And also the question to you, what are the priorities now when it comes to recognition of Taliban and assistance to the population of Afghanistan?
Okay, I hope this functions. Okay, good. So I'll start with the first question. You have assumed right. I think that's no secret. We as socialist youth have always been critical of the military intervention. But what is important to say is that the most thing we have always criticized is that war is always made because people want to make money by doing war. And I think that's one point that hasn't been discussed right now, that the US and the European Union have made profit by having this war in Afghanistan, and that they kind of I wouldn't say that they wanted it, but they kind of made profit from it. And I think we always have to think about that when we talk about the war in Afghanistan. So what the question was that if the NATO troops should have stayed there, I think they should have, because as Bruno already said, we knew that the situation would completely escalate, that there will be big problems, that people will die. And that's why all these people in Afghanistan, Afghan women, children, and also men, needed our help. They needed our help to live in peace, to kind of have a bit kind of hope, so they don't have to die and that they don't have to flee from their country. So I think it was important that we, as the Western countries and the Western world, give them the help that they needed. It's not the perfect solution, we all know that, but I don't think that any one of us do have a perfect solution when we talk about the war in Afghanistan. But what for me is most important is that people don't die, that people are safe, that people don't have to think about if they will wake up the next day, if the children will have a peaceful life. And I think that we kind of had to give them this hope, that we fight for them, that we want them to give them their country so they can live also in their country and live in peace. I think that's one important thing that we may not forget, kind of. Yeah, so that's kind of what I think about the first question. And when we talk about the second question, that was what we have to do now. It is good that we talk about what has happened, what were the problems, whose fault was it. I think now it is important to talk about what we have to do, because everything has already happened. We can't change something about that. We can analyze it and take kind of we can think about what we could do better in the future, but now we have to talk about what we have to do now and what are the solutions, how can we help the people. And yeah, I know all of us know that not everyone from Afghanistan can live in Europe. That's yeah, it's not possible, but we have to work on a European solution that as many people as it is possible for all of the member states can be in Europe, can be safe, that all the women and children with all the families can live here and come to us. And when I think about evacuation, evacuation for me is not that all of these people have to come to Europe by foot, because that's not a human solution. I think that we have to kind of get to a human evacuation so that the people can come to us, that we have to organize flights to Afghanistan, to Europe, to Vienna, to Berlin, and etc. So I think that's what we have to do now. We have simply to help the people, and not only Europe. Your question what was the European Union can do. Also, America has to do something, the US, that was a bit wrong. And all other countries in the world that have a peaceful life, that can guarantee peace and can guarantee a good life for all of these people so that they don't have to die. I think that are the most important things that we have to talk about right now. And I hope that there will be a bigger discussion in the media and under the whole population, and that we don't only talk about Corona, that we talk about people that are dying right now because the Taliban don't give them peace. Right.
Thank you very much for being outspoken when it comes to the question of welcoming refugees from Afghanistan, for being clear on this. Of course, we all know that this is a very a topic that divides Austrians and Europeans. Anyway, I'd like to come back to Clarisse. We've already analyzed the situation, and you've already brought in the OSCE to some extent into the discussion. We also know that especially the neighboring countries of Afghanistan bear the most. Daniel also put it out, bear the most the consequences of the recent failure, disaster. Islamism, terrorism might again or further increase in the region, but we've already talked about it. Europe as well will bear the consequences, see the repercussions. And we can already witness this. There's much talk now about European security, the influence, the repercussions of the events in Afghanistan on European security, EU security. What would you say, Clarisse, is European security, in a very broad sense, another fallout, as we put it in the title of our event? Is European security a fallout from the withdrawal in Afghanistan? How would you assess this?
Thank you. I'm not sure European security is a fallout, but I think there is a fallout. That fallout sort of concerns us all. I would pick up where Bruno was, and I'm afraid in this case I might be as if not more pessimistic than Bruno, which is sometimes hard to do. But when Bruno said correctly that the Americans are very unlikely to have any appetite to go anywhere and do anything anymore, except maybe they can just Asia, and even there, big question mark. I would say the same applies to everyone. And anyway, what applies to America applies to NATO at large, because there is no NATO operation, there is no OSCE operation without the Americans. So I would say, I think generally speaking, the appetite of anyone in the so-called West, and once again, I have a slight hesitation ever to use the term, but let's term it for matter of ease. I think nobody will have any appetite to intervene anywhere and anyhow and invest anything militarily, politically, or humanitarian or otherwise, with very, very sort of low level cases in terms of money and food funneled through the UN, but sort of proper interventions, the way sort of we define them, I think we will not see, which again in reverse means for everyone, for the things that you asked, for the Middle East that you asked for before, that the so-called bad guys, or those who do not live in our so-called rules-based order, or to wish to have a different rules-based order or their rules, of course feel empowered and emboldened and will try. I mean, you saw it in Afghanistan and Iraq every time, even on local level, it's good enough if you just have a change in general. The guy will be tested, how the person reacts, if there's just change of command in one general. And on broader level, that is even worse. So now with the Americans and NATO, let's face it, as such, having left Afghanistan the way they did, there will be an appetite to test the remaining NATO missions, for example, in Iraq, where the idea was that NATO, at least pro forma, in terms of heading and badges, takes over from the Americans some of the capacity building roles. I expect NATO's appetite to be very low on this, and I also expect the opposition against that from certain Shia fractions, for example, to be much higher than it would have been before. The second point where I would also agree with Bruno, and where you triggered me indeed, because it's one of the things that I can jump up and down even when we have dinner with friends. You described it in another way, but I would say we have simply replaced diplomacy and politics with narratives. And narratives are meant to create an illusion with somebody else, a third party. But what we have what we are doing currently is that we have replaced policies by programs and projects, and we have replaced politics by narratives. And then if the narratives don't hold up against reality, then we are surprised, or we tend to be surprised. You don't win a war with narratives. I'm sorry, neither a political war, nor a military war, nor any other thing. And as long as we are hiding behind make-believe, very collectively, hiding behind make-believe sentences and so-called high values, which are not sustained by anything and no will to sustain them with political, economic, and military investments, I think that will not end well. And finally, and last point, Gerd, because you mentioned recognition. As a diplomat, at least, I'm very much in favor of a very differentiated, and it's important, terms are really important here. I, myself, at least, I'm not aware of anybody talking about recognition. Before you have recognition, you have contacts, then you have talking, then you have relations, and then you have recognition, which is a very formal act. And I wouldn't jump the gun, and also in the debate to immediately from yesterday anyway talk about, shall we recognize them now? I think the debate is, and the debate needs to be way more differentiated. We are now talking about contacts and who, on which level and on what, and then about talking, which is already taking place anyway and did in Doha for a while. And then the question is about relations, but I think the question about recognition is quite a far way off. Thank you.
Portugal has always been an advocate of strong transatlantic relationship, strong transatlantic alliance. As I already said, there's now much talk about European, EU, to be precise, EU strategic autonomy. The President of the European Commission, von der Leyen, pleaded for a European Defence Union last Wednesday in her speak on the state of the European Union. Is this a realistic goal in your point of view? How far should European strategic autonomy go? And in your point of view, what would that mean for the transatlantic alliance?
Yes, well, I think it's becoming more and more inevitable. It seems that now every month we have a new story showing us why the concept, we can try to use different words, but why the concept in the end is necessary. I'd just like to say that sometimes I think the concept is misinterpreted. So strategic autonomy does not mean that Europeans want to go their own way, separate from the Americans. We may, in fact, have the same broad goals. We may share the same values. We may disagree on methods and means. And then I think it's actually very good to have a discussion with our American friends about how to do things better. Part of the errors in Afghanistan, I think, came out of the fact that many ideas coming from Washington didn't get the necessary contradictory from Europe. Europeans were very removed from the hard security angle. As you know, many European armies in Afghanistan had such rigid and strict rules of engagement that they were in fact removed from actual fighting. You know that some of them could not get out at night, for example. This created some resentment with the Americans as well, thought that they were fighting and the Europeans were traveling. So we need something that is more balanced, a real exchange of opinions, but it doesn't mean sometimes I think the enemies of strategic autonomy want to present it as the Europeans want to be closer to China. That's not what the concept means. The concept means we have capacities. We may even agree entirely on the ends, but we have capacities and we may disagree on the means. So I think that's a misunderstanding of the concept. And the second misunderstanding is I think some people think there will be one day where Europeans get together in a big pan-European conference and they make a decision to have an army and to have a defense union. I don't think it will happen like that. It will be a very gradual, almost imperceptible process. So I keep hearing now from European diplomats in Kabul. I don't believe Austria had an embassy. Very few countries had. The Nordics, Germany, Italy, France, and Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden. I think only 8 EU countries, and then the EU embassy. But European diplomats there are, when they talk about the errors that Europeans committed, they mention, for example, perhaps we should have had our own base, our own military base, our own airfield, so that when it comes to the end, and you know, the US decided to close Bagram Air Base for reasons that remain unexplained. It has 2 runways, it's far from the city. If you've been to Kabul, the airport is right in the middle of the city, completely congested, there's no way to keep people apart. How on earth would someone think that this is the best place to evacuate 200, 300,000 people, which would be necessary in a matter of days? I mean, every time I think about the choices that were made, I get quite angry. So why Bagram Airfield was closed, no one understands, but then maybe Europeans should have their own base. So when I think about strategic autonomy, maybe in the next time that we are in a mission with US, we'll have our own airfield under our control. Because one thing that has created enormous resentment among Europeans is that we wanted to bring our people out. And you know, President Biden is very happy, he thinks that he brought everyone out that he wanted to bring out. Europeans are not happy at all. Many countries left hundreds of their own citizens there. The EU embassy staff, very few of the EU embassy staff were evacuated. That's the people we had given an explicit guarantee that they would be safe. So there's a lot of resentment in European capitals against the US because the US embassy gave their colleagues, European colleagues, the guarantee that US military would protect the green zone even after the Taliban arrived, if they did, and the airport, and that Europeans would be able to evacuate. And then all this was dropped overnight, all these guarantees, and then even worse, the last 5 or 6 days of use of the airport before the final flight, the Europeans were kicked out, literally kicked out. And so this creates a lot of resentment. Maybe what strategic autonomy means is that in the future we'll be a little more suspicious, a little more cautious. I think there's been a lot of, it's not just trusting America's goodwill, it's actually more than that. It's trusting America's power. This mystique of American power that when the Americans decide they can do anything. And you know, my experience in Kabul was, no one, even the Afghans, they couldn't believe that the Taliban would be in Kabul before the evacuation was completed. They couldn't believe that. And when it started to happen, and it started to become inevitable, actually what it started to hear from Afghans was all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories. Why are the Americans doing this? And you know, I personally had to try to convince people there's no conspiracy here. It's just a monumental failure, but there's no conspiracy. They're not planning anything behind your backs. But this trust in American power, I think, is now much reduced, and maybe that's a good thing, not a bad thing. And so strategic autonomy will be step by step, taking more responsibility in small things from now on, and it won't be a big constitutional moment where we move from strategic dependence to strategic autonomy overnight. I also think there's a misunderstanding about that that needs to be corrected.
Thank you very much for explaining to me or to us what strategic autonomy really means. So, yeah, not a defense union right now, and it will be a gradual development. Now, again, Daniel in Washington, I'd like to ask you for your assessment on this discussion about strategic autonomy of the European Union. How does Washington perceive this renewed discussion? Will the US accept stronger European autonomy, a gradual autonomy in military affairs? Or even in the long run, independence, military independence, or a European Defense Union at some day. How do you see this? How does Washington perceive this? Maybe explaining also the background. We know that the US have always been demanding more efforts from the European NATO partners when it comes to financial support of NATO. Yeah, this for the background. How would you assess the situation and the discussion?
Thank you. Well, where to start on that? You know, frankly, I don't think anybody knows what strategic autonomy means. It's a buzzword that politicians in Europe, some European capitals use, but nobody agrees on it. BRUNO has one view of it. People in Poland have a very different view of it. I have officials, EU officials, call me up and say, can you explain what it means? We have no clue. So I don't think it's a buzzword that gets in the way of whatever it is we're talking about. I agree with Bruno that this is gradual. It's so gradual, in fact, it's generational, because what we're talking about is the Europeans have the capabilities to become autonomous in this way, and the answer is no. And any effort to build those capabilities would take a generation. We're talking about, decades, not. And there's no effort underway right now to put money behind that. So, in a good Yankee jargon, you should put your money where your mouth is if you're serious about any of this. And one doesn't see any effort at all among Europeans to do that. I think where we agree on a more productive discussion would be to talk about where I think there is agreement. We want a more capable Europe. We want a Europe that's more capable at doing the kinds of defense things that right now it is completely reliant on the United States for doing. If you think not only about Afghanistan, the idea that the Europeans would have a separate military base in Afghanistan is interesting, but they couldn't fly their own aircraft there to get there because they're reliant on US refueling and other types of support. If you look at France, who tries to be the leader in calling for this, France in the Sahel, for instance, completely dependent on US in-flight refueling, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We have deep cooperation with France, special forces there. If you think even of the Balkans, which is an EU-led operation, it still relies on critical US capabilities that the EU could not perform on its own. So let's be serious about what we're talking about here. The United States is not just talking about money when it says 2%, it's talking about capabilities. And so let's try to define that in an operational way. So NATO, for instance, has a jargon it uses that defines how militaries operate. One is called a level of ambition, NATO's level of ambition. I think it would be very interesting to know what is the European level of ambition when it comes to capabilities and in what time frame to do what. That would be an interesting discussion and good to be had. I would make it simple in terms of what we're talking about. I think the US would support Europe being the first responder to crises in and around its periphery. NATO would be there, but NATO doesn't have to respond to all of these things. Europeans, whether it's the EU or in some other coalitions, could respond and have the capabilities to respond to crises all around their periphery. The US would be quite supportive of that. And yet, it's a generation between saying that today and having Europe being able to do that. So we should be conscious of the great gap in European capability to get anywhere close to what that term would mean. Because if you really want to be serious about strategic autonomy, then you're talking about nuclear weapons. Is France prepared to extend the nuclear umbrella over all of the EU? No. Are other European countries interested in starting to engage on that discussion? No. So, it gets us distracted from where I think we have some agreement, which is to build up European capabilities so Europe can do these types of things that I mentioned. I think that would be helpful. We have done this in the past. We already have mechanisms by which if NATO decides or is unwilling, the United States, Canada unwilling to engage, the Europeans can already perform with common joint task forces and with what are called Berlin Plus mechanisms by which they could already conduct these types of European-led operations. We put that in place a couple decades ago. So the US was not opposed to that. It was trying to ensure that the efforts the Europeans do are separable but not separate from our overall defense efforts, which are strategic in nature. goodwill, we could work on this, but this is not, the politics of this is going in a different direction.
Thank you. What I'm taking out of this, especially, is the USA want the European Union to be more capable. LEJLA, I also would like to ask you on your position on this discussion on strategic autonomy. I'd like to quote the SPÖ manifesto or some short sentence. It says that the EU has a moral obligation to work for peace and security in the world, and that the evolving common security and defense policy takes account of the neutrality of some member states, such as Austria, and provides a suitable framework for this approach. Yeah. How do you see this? What is your position on an ever closer cooperation in defense and security matters, and on the goal, maybe if it's a very long one, goal of a European defense union? How can neutral Austria be part of it? What would you say?
I think that when we work together and kind of have the same thing in mind, it's always better. And I also maybe have a bit of different opinion of the European Union than other people of the socialist views. I think it is a good union. I think it is important to work together because we as small European countries such as Austria or other ones, we can't do that big decisions on our own. So it's important that we are kind of together and that we try to form our opinion and the European decisions so that we can make them, because I don't think it would be possible if only Austria, Germany, etc. are doing all these decisions on their own. So that's important that we have the European Union, that we are trying to make decisions together. But if we want to kind of make a bigger effort on that, then I'm not that sure, because if we want to do more defense politics and want to have a bigger strategy and want to be more not to depend on the US, we also have to have more money to do that. So then the question that I ask for myself and for all of us is, where do we take that money from? Because we don't have that money. So how do we finance all of that? And then my point of view is that we shouldn't kind of minimize other budgets, that we have to find other solutions to do all of this. So either we get more money or we minimize some budgets. So we have to do that decision. And in my point of view, we shouldn't minimize those really important budgets that we have, that the European Union is giving. Austria, for example, I'm from Burgenland, that's part of Austria, and we get a lot of money from the European Union so that we get bigger and have more possibilities in Burgenland. And I think all of these budgets are really, really important, and that we shouldn't kind of minimize all of that. So there are other possibilities so that we can do bigger decisions in defense politics and do more. When we talk about military, it is that we have to get more money, and that then we have to talk about how we should do that. And yeah, that's what I wanted to kind of explain when we talk about all of this. The decision is kind of hard. I don't know if we should do that, if it is important to do that. When we talk about Afghanistan, it would probably be better that European Union could do the decisions on their own. So maybe the European Union wants to help them and the US doesn't want to. So that's why it would be important that we can make decisions on our own. But yeah, the question is, how do we get to that. And yeah, when I think about the history of the European Union, it always takes many, many years until we get that, what we want. So yeah, I think it is kind of hard to talk about that. Yeah, I hope I could kind of sum it up a bit. Yeah, and then we talked about the neutrality. That's other topic when you talk about all of this. Austria has a really specific role in the European Union as we are neutral, and I think it is hard to be part of European Union if you are a neutral state, because there are decisions that are being made that we as a neutral state simply cannot do, because we have to be neutral in war decisions, etc. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say on that behalf.
Thank you. Looking at the time progressing, I would like to invite you here in the audience, and maybe also on Zoom, Facebook and YouTube, to bring in your perspective and ask questions. Stephanie, please, and Heinz Gärtner, and the man in the second row, Stephanie Fenkert, Director of the International Institute for Peace.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone who joined the discussion. I think it's very important also what has been said also by Clarisse. It's about when it comes to military intervention, like from the immediate point, it's like if you do not like really have a clear target, you actually end up in what was happening with Afghanistan. There was no clear target. I think there was not really an assessment of how nation building actually does function. Does it even function in Afghanistan? Could it even function? If you do not assess like how the people actually live there and how actually the society is functioning around tribals, around religion and all those issues attached to it. And then, of course, I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, I mean, the Taliban were in power in '96 already, so for 5 years, we do not really care so much about nation building in Afghanistan. But, of course, then 9/11 happened. And this is, of course, one of the biggest contexts I think we should take into account, which is actually why then there had to be a reaction from the sides of United States in this sense, also, of course, with NATO. What I think I would like to ask also in this context is, we didn't really talk so much about it because it's not so much European security, but we know it can backfire. But what can the European Union actually do to what also you said when it comes to the people actually there? How can we support them? We cannot, of course, like put all, and Clarisse also mentioned it, we cannot say, okay, so all educated people working for the values as we call it, or also human rights, we cannot take them all out of the country. So what could the European Union do? Is it in exchange for humanitarian assistance? I don't know, like to get, the Taliban will need also some foreign money in the end. So is there maybe a possibility that the European Union could be, I don't know, like supporting humanitarian existence in exchange, for example, for some at least minimum human rights when it comes to women, when it comes to girls? I mean, this is one of the topics I think we should be discussing. And then a second question, because we did not really talk so much about the regional actors, and I mean, Pakistan has 1.4 million refugees already, and I mean, they are, have been from conflicting areas, have always been there. So also about the regional actors, I mean, it's not only Russia. It was mentioned, I think, by Dan Hamilton, that when people talk about China being, I heard that recently, that China has been one of the winners. I don't think that anyone actually won, maybe but the Taliban. But for now, I think what can also the region be doing in this context? And I'd be happy to hear what you think about that as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. I would suggest collecting 3 questions. So Heinz Gärtner, please.
Thank you, Heinz Gärtner, University of Vienna and International Institute for Peace as well. So the 20 years war was not good. So it was a right decision by President Biden to withdraw the troops and to end the war. So what is the record of the war? We have 250,000 deaths. We have 50 or 60,000 civilian casualties. Every year we had 500 victims by terrorist attacks. There was a climate of anxiety and fear. So it couldn't continue like that. So, and the success story is very limited. The illiterate rate by women is still 80%, over 80%. 2% have access to higher education.
So we cannot sell the war as some success story. So that's my first point. The second point is what should the European Union do? So we should be careful not just immediately jump to military solutions. We had 40 years military intervention in Afghanistan, it didn't work. So European Union with any intervention force or military strategic autonomy couldn't have solved the problem either. So what should have the European Union done? Yes, being a first responder, but a diplomatic first responder. Set up immediately a security conference like the Helsinki one, for example, involving all the parties, so the big states like China, Russia, the US, that there is no vacuum, because everybody was talking about the vacuum, but also the neighboring states and also the Taliban and maybe several factions of the Taliban. So now I'm here, not so fast. The European Union cannot act that way. A state in the European Union could have done it, like Austria is a neutral state. The US and NATO are non-starters, so they would not be accepted by the Taliban. So if somebody says not so fast, who is doing it now? Qatar is doing it. Qatar is the hub of diplomatic activities now. So Qatar can do it, and it will emerge basically setting up several security conferences on Afghanistan, not only on refugees. So we were talking only about refugees. And now we are talking only about military. We should talk about diplomacy of the European Union.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my question is firstly, why do the Americans and European countries fight against corruption in their own countries and support the same in our countries, corruption? I am especially here mentioning Iraq and Kurdistan region, where I come from. The corruption is endemic, and this is American-made, European-made. And this is the main reason to producing dissatisfaction, extremism, and the failure of the government. So, especially the second question is for, I think, Ms. Terry. Don't you expect the same fate for the Iraqi and Kurdistan government like the former Afghan government because of the corruption and dissatisfaction there, which is mainly foreign-made? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the topic of corruption. And Hannes SWOBODA, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have 2 points. The one is on defense. I think some times ago we said Europe is spending overall the half of the amount the US is spending, but with an efficiency of 10% of the US. Well, however you count efficiency. So I think I want to support what Bruno said. It's not from one point to another to have all of a sudden a European army. And I think even Daniel Hamilton said more or less the same. You have to do some specific activities. For example, bringing people back from somewhere. It can also be a catastrophic situation. It can be whatever else. That we don't have transport facility is crazy. Also, Austria had to take people back. It's not a question of neutrality, for example, in this case. We did it via Iran and via Pakistan. But I think you have, of course, to define what to do, and it must be parallel, of course, to the diplomatic efficiency. But certain activities have to be done in order to be at least a reliable partner internationally, not for intervention, military intervention, but at least for cases where you have to care for your own citizen in some other places in the world. So I think defense issue is one. But when the Americans always said 2% of the budget, 2% of the budget, that's nonsense. It's nonsense to do it on the numbers. You have to see the efficiency or the inefficiency of European defense spending. So even if you don't spend more, you could do it much more efficiently if you would do it together and concentrate on some issues. The second, maybe the question to Bruno. Heinz already mentioned this, what we can do internationally. If we agree with what also Daniel said, that there are no clear winners for the moment, there are people who are perhaps in a better situation, a country and a worse situation. But wouldn't it be good for the European Union, even for the US, together with Russia, together especially with China, with Pakistan and the others in the neighborhood, to at least guarantee some minimum rights in the country. Because in all other countries, for example, girls can go to schools, can go to university. So even the Chinese and the Russian and the Pakistanis could support such a policy. So at least withdrawal military should not mean withdrawal from support, not only humanitarian, but also in guaranteeing or in convincing, maybe in connection with financial aid. You get financial aid, but some basic minimum rights especially for women, should be guaranteed, and that should be the condition where we can help you also economically. The second issue would be, of course, reduction at least of the growing of poppy and narcotics trading, because there are some issues which we can deal together where Russia and China would be an interest, is my opinion. Maybe, Bruno, you can comment if you are of totally different opinion or whatever you can say to that.
Okay, Bruno, please.
Let me respond to the three questions because they are very similar, Hans and Stephanie and so I think this is a choice that has to be made now. The EU could have a real impact if it decides to try to have an impact. When you follow the news from Afghanistan, there's a lot of uncertainty, for example, whether the Taliban are going to allow girls in secondary school, young women, to go to secondary school or not. One day you hear they have banned it. The other day there's some different news coming from a Taliban spokesperson. So I think there's actually divisions among the Taliban themselves. And obviously the EU could step in and exercise the power and the leverage that it has, the money that they desperately need, and in return get something that is not perfect, but that is better than nothing. For example, in universities, do women go to universities, but they have to have a curtain separating the men from the women in the university? Many people in Europe will find that offensive. But it's certainly for those women who have already started university, are now at risk of having to drop out. The families that saves money not easy in Afghanistan for their daughters to go to university. I personally, if you ask me, I think the EU should do this. And we're never going to have a perfect world. And especially after the collapse of the last 20 years, this is what we can do now. I thought there would be some hope for this. I had some rumors that Germany was close to recognizing the Taliban. Then the Taliban announced the government. It turned out to be disappointing, let us say. I'm not even referring to the absence of women, because I thought that was expected, but the absence of Tajiks and Uzbeks, and even worse, the fact that 4 ministers are listed by the UN as wanted terrorists. So that doesn't help. So the problem now is, if I were still a politician, I would be very reluctant to recognize the Taliban, because it's very easy for a politician to get in trouble. Not only would be criticized for accepting the government as it is, but if tomorrow or next week a video comes out of a woman being lashed on the street or whipped on the street, then obviously the politician that had just recognized the Taliban or defended that or supported that, or the EU ambassador and the EU commissioner who in fact reopened the embassy, offered some financial support in exchange for this or that. So, I think European public opinion has to decide. If we want to have an impact, limited one, then we have to be willing to compromise and to accept that some things are not going to be perfect. But everyone here and all the journalists outside will be very ready to jump on the politician that makes the first movement. It's not surprising that no one wants to make it. It's not surprising, in my view, that eventually Germany will not recognize the Taliban, that the US will not recognize the Taliban, EU will not recognize the Taliban. It will be up to Pakistan and China to have some impact. They will not be as focused on questions like women education. They will be more focused on mining activity for China, Xinjiang terrorists. Pakistan will be more interested in having full control over the government. And I think, if you ask me, that's what's going to happen. But you know, there's a reason. There's in our societies, and there hasn't been still a learning experience where we accept that our power is limited. But if we accept it's limited, we have a real impact, like Stephanie was saying. But it's a bit of a difficult choice, especially in the current environment, where politicians are under a lot of pressure from NGOs, from the media, to aim for perfection, and everything less than perfection is called a betrayal of our values. So why should you take the risk of being called a traitor to democratic and liberal values if you can just keep out of it? And I think most politicians, if not all, in Western democracies are going to do that.
Thank you. Daniel, Clarisse, Leila, there are still some questions open.
I think I would partly agree with Bruno, but only partly. One, yes, you cannot replace political will in any country, including in Afghanistan, yes, but you can help and create it. And one, if you take everyone out who might be actually useful there and an ally and a partner there, then you're basically undermining your own base. Yes, the incentives can include some of the things that Bruno have mentioned, but no, the alternative is not between nothing, as I said already before, and recognition. There is, as diplomats, we know a number of in-between things. It doesn't have to be the president and the ambassador or whatever. There's other people, services and whatever, and there is not just recognition, but there is, as I said, relations, tests, balloons, trial and error, etc., which are still, as you're very right, you're saying, might still be accused of by journalists. But I still have to insist as a diplomat, there is not just 1 and 100. There is a lot of, as you previously said, gradual steps that you could do to test the ground and to test the commitment. Further on, also, it's also not just, quote unquote, about values and women, etc. There's hard interests. Whether we like it or not, we are talking about one of the most important drug routes into Europe. We are talking about very important organized crime networks, which is very important. We are talking about, we have hardly mentioned it today because there's a new subject, but Daesh until yesterday was important. Now we talk Afghanistan, which is, by the way, the same thing up to a certain degree. So there is threats emanating towards our own security from Afghanistan, which, and here I would agree with Bruno, doesn't allow us to turn around. As I always say in all of this lectures and conferences, the famous sentence, imagine there's war and you don't go there, then war is coming to you. Actions have consequences, non-actions also have consequences. So simply turning around and saying, let's pretend it's not happening, won't work. We will have to properly first analyze and then identify where our interests are, and I have to insist on interests in addition to values, and then create the relevant incentives. And that also brings me to the question of our Iraqi Kurdish colleague. I think a lot of people are looking at the situation and learning positive and negative lessons. I've already mentioned that I think NATO will be careful in how much it builds up its engagement in Iraq, which was planned. I've already mentioned that both Daesh and various non-state actors, including PKK, including Shia militias, are probably currently looking how they can exploit the situation. But also, as you rightly, I would hope and think that people in certain regions are thinking about their own behavior, and including when it comes to corruption. And there is elections in Iraq on 10 October, and I would hope that some of the leaders look at the fate of some of the Afghan leaders and take note of it. This is within a diplomatic framework how far I would go. But I think you have got a point. I wouldn't compare it. I cannot compare because I don't know Afghanistan well enough. I wouldn't describe the situation as bad as you're saying, but I fully understand your point. And I would agree with you that I hope that people are watching and learning a degree of lesson and behavioral changes. Thank you.
Daniel,
Can I just say, yes, the participant who identified corruption, I want to just wholeheartedly agree with his point. We have allowed ourselves to get intertwined with corrupt mechanisms, practices, leaders that undermine our credibility absolutely with many of the people of the region. And you know, corruption is becoming a national security issue that we have to understand, not just far away, but in our own backyards. The tolerance of corrupt practices all through the Western Balkans, close to Austria, is unconscionable. It's happening within the European Union. The United States is not immune to it either. Yet we have not identified it as a national security issue that we should address. So I would agree with that. On the other point, though, just to, if this is the last word, that somehow we were profiting, winning resources by our engagement in Afghanistan. I mean, I have to absolutely disagree with that. You know, 20-year engagement in Afghanistan was a tremendous drain on American, NATO, European resources, lives. It diverted us from all sorts of other things that we needed to pay attention to. It started because of attacks on our country based in Afghanistan. It started as an anti-terror operation, but it morphed into something, as I said, much bigger, vague, and beyond our capacity. And what you're seeing here, at least on the US side, is an effort to realign US resources to turn to more central questions affecting the United States' interest and values, and I would argue probably many European interests and values, that we were overextending ourselves in lots of other areas where we had neither the capacity nor the knowledge to change and remake societies using particularly military power. That era is coming and is ending. The question now is, how do we turn our resources together, I would hope, to some challenges that we're now facing? And that's what you're seeing the Biden administration trying to do. I don't think there's anything from the Afghanistan episode that challenges US commitment to European security, for instance. There's nothing in that area. In fact, you've seen the Biden administration reverse Trump administration decisions to lower troop levels. In fact, we're adding troops to Europe, and the commitment in NATO is quite strong at the moment. So I don't see anything about that. And even this debate we're having about, you know, so-called strategic autonomy, it's about trying to get Europe to be a more capable ally and partner. It's not trying to hold the Europeans down. It's trying to get them to do something and get the capabilities so they are able to do that. What Afghanistan should have showed us is that there is no Europe when it comes to this discussion. You know, we saw different rules of engagement, Bruno pointed out, for different European countries. We saw different mandates each had for their particular engagement in Afghanistan, widely different capabilities when it came to implementing any of those mandates, and completely different strategic cultures among many European countries. How you turn that into a defense union is beyond me, frankly. And the fact that the country that really immediately came out against the idea of more strategic autonomy was Sweden, was quite striking to me. A non-aligned EU member state said, we don't want any part of that discussion because that's not going to lead us anywhere. And Swedes are, you know, very capable country with their military, and they're not having part of it. So, you know, this is going to take years and years, and I would just suggest we focus on capability rather than more talk, which is at the moment all that I'm seeing.
We talked much about, actually, of course, of Afghanistan, and now about EU security and the future of the common security and defense policy, etc., strategic autonomy. But we didn't talk much about the OSCE. And of course, we know that Afghanistan isn't a member of the OSCE, and as Hannes said when wrapping up the discussion of this morning, the revitalization of the OSCE was one of the main topics. A question to all the speakers: should the OSCE play a certain role when it comes to dealing with the disaster in Afghanistan, or is this something completely out of question. Clarisse, at the beginning you already mentioned, you talked about briefly of the OSCE, but maybe you could briefly add.
I think I largely gave my answer. I think what the OSCE currently produces in terms of concrete, tangible output on European security and stability is weak. I don't think anybody is denying that. I think we are. The field missions have quite sort of old mandates, which are largely security and development capacity building. By the way, very much focusing on the things that Daniel has recently mentioned, corruption, human trafficking, drugs, organized crime, etc. So away from hard and military security, very much to other forms which are equally part of security, including even economic governance, etc. So I think some things are done as usual, but sort of whether the OSCE should now go out of theatre and be active there, as I already sort of was joking diplomatically, yes and no. The OSCE is a platform, and it can be as successful as the people are who make use of it. If anybody wants to make use of the platform, and yes, I think it can be, I'm speaking now on my own behalf, just to be careful, can it be, could somebody else take sort of an empty chair or have a chair, at least on the platform, be it even China or others, in order to discuss out-of-regional issues? I think yes. I've been thinking the same already about open sky agreements and other issues that recently went down. So I think the OSCE could be a platform, but that doesn't depend on us civil servants or secondees, etc. That depends on the political will of the participating states, in particular the large ones. So in particular, we are back to our American friends, the Russians, etc. And from what I see, the answer is that doesn't seem the first platform that they're looking into. Also, beyond, it's not just that the OSCE is not the platform. I don't currently see multilateralism as an instrument that is being first of choice. As I said, we have largely tactical, transactional, short-term, one-on-one transactional agreements, which is the opposite of long-term strategic multilateral agreements. Personally, I've worked for the UN, the EU, and the OSCE. I'm clearly a multilateralist, otherwise I wouldn't have done it. I don't think we are currently the flavor of the month. And that is not anything that I can change. This is part of political strategic decision-making, and that does not feature because countries seem to think they are better off on their own. That is merely a plea that we can hold, not anything that we can change. But on the positive, again, as I said, there currently is considerations. There is considerations in how far we can be of assistance, for example, in terms of borders, drug intelligence and similar things. We are active not in Afghanistan, but at least in other countries, very much, as I said, on corruption, on organized crime, on investigative journalism, on soft power issues. And we are hosting, here Albania is hosting a relatively large new influx of fairly high level and high skilled Afghans with whom we are currently thinking about how to use that. Again, I don't believe in depleting countries from their own best people, on the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruno, Leila, Daniel, would you like to comment on
I'm not a great expert on the OSCE. I'm not a great expert on the OSCE, but it seems to me that now it's very difficult. Perhaps something that could have been thought of before, where if NATO had agreed that perhaps the OSCE could have provided some much needed experience and skills when it came to training, for example, local police force, perhaps also the election monitoring. I don't know if this was discussed at all or if NATO was just not interested in that possibility. But now
election monitoring was once done. The OSCE once did election monitoring.
Right. But now I don't see how it could even be conceivable. Certainly the Taliban, they don't know what it is, I would think, but once you explain to them what the OSCE is, I don't think they would allow for any presence whatsoever. I don't think so. I don't think it's appropriate right now. Let's wait. Things could evolve in the next year or so, and then. But certainly, in principle, this I think goes back to some things Hans said, that perhaps another lesson from Afghanistan is that we can act not only within the institutions where we are most comfortable, but act more in institutions where we are not totally comfortable and where we have different partners, but allows us to do other things that we can't do when we are in the framework of EU or NATO. Because, by the way, within the framework of the EU and NATO, the demands and requirements are different. Gives you a certain flexibility to act within the OSCE, where you have to work with very different partners. So in principle, I think that's something to be discussed, and maybe one way to reinvigorate the OSCE in the future. But I don't think not with the Taliban.
Daniel, what do you comment?
Well, I think the main contribution the OSCE could theoretically provide is not on the territory of a non-OSCE member state like Afghanistan, even though it's a cooperative partner, but to deal with the spillover effects for OSCE member states, where OSCE has experience. What was just mentioned, refugee issues are going to be important, the issues of drugs, of corruption, things that the OSCE has some experience in, where they do have field capabilities. The problem, though, is that OSCE members don't agree on whether to use the organization in that way, especially in Central Asian states. So I think that's the problem. The OSCE has tools that could be useful, but getting the political consensus to support that, I think at the moment it seems quite doubtful.
Thank you. This is something that we discussed today. Actually, the OSCE had the tools, but they are not used. Laila, is there anything you would like to add?
Not this discussion, but I think the question of EU hasn't been discussed that much, what the EU could actually do. Clarissa has already elaborated a bit on that, but I think one big thing that the EU has to do is to understand the culture and the lives of people in Afghanistan, because I think it is always different to live in a different country, and when you make decisions and want to help them, you have to think about their lives and how they live, and you can't simply put the democracy of a Western world over another country. I don't think that is possible right now, that you have to work on that you get to that, but I think it wouldn't work from one day to another, and I think that's something that we have to think about, that we have to understand how some things work, but that we always have to have human rights in our minds, and that's the most important thing, that human rights are always kind of granted in those countries, but some things we can't just pressure it, because I think then it wouldn't work. But that's just my personal opinion. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to add, that would probably be really important. Yeah.
The importance of human rights, I think, at the end of our discussion. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to the audience here in the Orania and on our different media, as I said, Facebook, YouTube, and Zoom. The video recording will be available on this media, so you can watch some sequences again if you're interested. Let me thank also the partners of the Karl-Renner-Institut in organizing the Vienna Peace and Security Talks and this panel discussion tonight. The Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung Regional Office is in Vienna, the International Institute for Peace and the Society for Eurasian Studies. Thanks a lot for the good cooperation as always. Yeah, and there's the good news. No, I forgot to thank, of course, the speakers. Clarisse PASZTORY in Tirana, Daniel Hamilton in Washington, and Bruno Maçães and Leila VISNJIC. Thanks a lot for being with us and for sharing your points of view on Afghanistan and the lessons to learn. Thank you very much. And now the good news, as I was already about to announce, there is some food for us, for those who are here in person. And we are all invited to discuss maybe a bit longer what we've been discussing recently. Thanks a lot, and see you again soon at one of the events.